Many of you know that 4 years ago, at 57 years old, I went back to school. I enrolled in a Doctor of Ministry program at Asbury Seminary, and I knew exactly what I needed to learn. I was very aware of a huge gap in my knowledge, my experience, my understanding, and I needed to upgrade. That meant that I spent 3 years in the program every single day reading, studying, writing about post-founder sustainability. That's right, that's what I studied. What happens to churches, mission organizations, nonprofits after the founder generation is no longer leading? Basically what I did during that season of study was write my job description for the foreseeable future. It is so often that ministries, churches, NGOs, nonprofits, even the for-profit corporate world, when the founder generation is no longer leading, some will continue on. Many, though, will start sometimes a slight decline, sometimes a major crash. Very few, but there are some, they start growing and really take off once the founder generation is no longer leading and others come and build on that foundation. We see this all throughout the Old Testament, that when sometimes there was a good king and the next generation and the next generation and the next after that, they didn't serve God. They took it a completely different direction. And so after decades of work and what we get to do together in every nation, I felt the need not to retire immediately and not to stop doing what I'm doing, but I felt I needed to go deeper and really intentionally and aggressively figure out what makes some organizations thrive when the founder generation is no longer actively leading the day-to-day, and what were the things that were done or not done that caused them to either plateau or decline. Right here is the 3 years of work. This is my dissertation. The title of it is on the side here, Post-Founder Sustainability, Building Ministries that Outlive Their Founders. Just a couple of brief thoughts that hopefully will help every one of us as leaders, whether we're leading a small group, a discipleship group, whether we're leading a kids ministry class, whether we're leading a department, or whether we're the senior pastor of a church, or maybe a site pastor or a branch pastor, or whatever terminology that we use. At some point, we will not be leading what we're currently leading, because nobody's living forever. Leadership is temporary because life on earth is temporary. And so at some point, we will either make a well thought out, well planned, strategic transition, or we won't. But one way or the other, a transition will happen, and unfortunately, they usually aren't well thought out and don't really go well. Here's the beginning of this dissertation. The purpose of this study was to discover why some denominations, mission organizations, and megachurches achieve post-founder generation sustainability, and secondly, to determine next steps for succession planning and leadership transition for every nation, churches, and ministries. Now again, this is not my announcement that I'm going anywhere, but it was studying to make sure we do this the best we possibly can. And I think application, again, to departments and smaller group ministry and Bible studies and worship teams and local congregations. The literature review, the interview process, the research, the scientific data revealed a three-part process of succession planning and leadership transition that doesn't ensure success, but it certainly gives us a better chance of succeeding and doing it right when we embrace those three. And I'm not going to talk about those three today. That's for another video, and that's for a book I'm writing. And I don't know what you've been doing during the lockdown and during the quarantine, but I'm trying to turn this dissertation, which is written for the academic committee that decided whether I graduate or not. I'm trying to turn this into a book that would be useful at all levels of ministry. So I'm not going to go into what that is, but I do want to talk about some broad principles that I think will help. When I was trying to figure out what to call the book, we had all kinds of titles floating around, and our comms director, Carlos Antonio, I should have asked him earlier because he came up with what is the working title now, the Leadership Runway. And Leadership Runway kind of captures the idea of the ministry and what we're trying to build, which is a takeoff and landing spot. Because that's basically what happens on a runway. I don't know how much you fly. I fly a lot, well, until 2020, but I'm on runways a lot, and it's really two things happen. Some planes are landing, other planes are taking off. There's nothing else that goes on a runway. The purpose is to land and take off. And the succession plan that I'm writing about and working on, it's about enabling leaders to take off and other leaders to land, to take off successfully and to land safely. That's what the Leadership Runway is all about. Now, if you've been a leader for any length of time, you know that taking off and landing is not a one-time event in life. We take off into ministry, and then often we will land and take off to another destination, because rarely does someone get in one leadership role and stay there for life. So this idea of transition, of succession planning and transition, the Leadership Runway, taking off, landing, we do that skill multiple times. And if we master the principles, then we're more successful each time we do it. Now, some problems with takeoff and landing. Think about this. Where do most flight problems happen? Believe it or not, most fatalities, they don't happen during the high and fast portion of a flight, which is most of the hours of a flight. You're high, going fast. Most fatalities happen during the low and slow part. You would think high is dangerous, but in reality, the vast majority of fatalities, of accidents, of problems in flights, it's when you're low and slow. Fast is actually safer. Once we take off and we're soaring, there aren't that many fatalities. 49% of airline fatalities happen during the landing phase. That's the low and slow. 14% happen during the takeoff phase. That's, again, low and slow. That leaves 63% landing and takeoff of the fatalities, 2/3. That leaves only 37% of the problems, the accidents that lead to fatalities, happen actually in the air, in the high and fast portion of the airline flight. When it comes to airline fatalities, there are three main problems. There's runway incursion, runway excursion, and runway confusion. Runway incursion means there is the aircraft we're talking about plus another aircraft on the same runway, or another vehicle that shouldn't be there, or maybe it should have already vacated the runway at the time. Or sometimes incursion happens when people are in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so what happens, the aircraft that's landing or taking off is either trying to dodge the other aircraft or vehicle or person, and that leads to going off and crashing, or they actually can't do that and run into these people or vehicles or planes that shouldn't be there. When I think about incursion, I think about the first time I ever flew from Manila to Baguio. Baguio sits 5,000 feet above sea level, and the airport is on a mountain. In those days, 30 years ago, they were small propeller airplanes that would land there. And I actually had a friend who lived on the other side of the runway. You would have to go to his house in a car. You would have to cross the runway to get to my friend's house. I'll never forget flying into Baguio and seeing cows on the runway. And they have people who have to move the cattle off so the planes can land. I don't know how many planes have crashed into a cow taking off and landing in Baguio, but that's an example. And sometimes in transition, there are incursions on the runway and we have to clear them off. Maybe it's people who are in the wrong position and we need to reposition them. Maybe it's baggage we're carrying as we're trying to transition into the next position and the next leadership role. Maybe it's work that needs to be left behind. I had a recent conversation with someone who is moving into a new leadership role, and they thought they could just carry all of this other work they were doing into that. And I was pleading, going, this isn't going to work. You can't just continue to add more leadership responsibility and more leadership time. No matter how many times you do that, there's still only 24 hours in a day. You don't have a time machine yet. And so you have to let go of this. You have to move this out of the way. And that's part of what the Leadership Runway does. The Leadership Runway strategy for leadership succession, part of what we're doing is helping leaders move things off of the runway so that we can really take off and so that others can land without crashing into things that shouldn't be there. Runway excursion is defined as just a single aircraft and there's no interference, but yet there's either a crash landing or taking off because usually, over 90% of the time, it's pilot error. Sometimes it's adverse weather conditions, which of course are not under our control. And then other times there's a mechanical failure. Sometimes that's due to faulty maintenance or negligence in maintenance, but it's pilot error, weather, or maintenance problems. The most common runway excursion problem is overrunning the runway, where the plane simply doesn't stop in time. It keeps going and crashes into whatever is at the end of the runway. I think about that in a ministry context and a leadership transition, and there are times when someone should land their leadership and they don't. They just keep going. And we're trying to get another leader to take off and fill that role, but yet for whatever reason, that landing is faulty. And if we don't land and stop what we've been doing in a proper time, doesn't mean we stop everything. We may go on and do other things and have another destination, but if that landing doesn't happen, it doesn't actually stop, there's no successful transition that happens. Our third problem with taking off and landing on the runway is called runway confusion. And that's obviously when a plane either tries to take off from the wrong runway or lands on the wrong runway. And there are many reasons why this happens, but it's obviously a dangerous thing. And I think there are times when people are confused about where they're supposed to park their ministry and where they're supposed to take off. I think about so many different types of runways that I've experienced, and because I fly internationally quite a bit, I'm usually on very large planes on very large and long runways. And of course, the runway size is determined by the size of the plane that's going to land and take off. And obviously, there's some parallel ideas with leadership transition concerning that. The size of the ministry determines the size of the runway for someone to take off or land. And when it's an older, large church or mission organization or ministry, then it certainly needs a much longer runway to take off and land versus a small group discipleship that includes maybe 5 or maybe 15 people. That's a much shorter runway, but it's still an important leadership runway for someone to build and for someone to utilize. I mentioned the Baguio airport that's up in the mountains. There was another interesting one. The first time I took my family on an island vacation in the Philippines, in an island in the southwestern portion of the Philippines. And when we were landing, we were in a 10-seater propeller plane, and we're coming in for the landing. We can see beautiful beaches on the right and left, but I don't see any buildings. And I don't see a runway. I'm looking out of the window, and I realize the runway is the grassy field with some dirt and rocks in it. And it was more of a bouncing landing. And so runways sometimes are made out of grass, dirt. Actually, there are even runways made of ice and sand, depending on where they are. And then obviously, in the major metropolitan areas and where large aircraft land, they are asphalt or concrete or a combination of asphalt and concrete. But the problem is when the pilot is confused about which one. Can you imagine trying to land a large plane on that dirt runway? It wouldn't work. Or trying to take off with a large plane from the short runway in the Baguio Mountains. The runway determines the size of plane that can land or take off. And the same with the Leadership Runway succession plan. What we want to do is teach every leader how to custom make a succession plan based on the ministry context and the leaders coming down the leadership pipeline. I want to take the next few minutes and look at a couple of biblical examples of leadership transition. I think about John the Baptist and his opening idea that framed his leadership when he was introducing Jesus. He said, "He must increase, I must decrease." And that's an attitude that every leader has to carry with them into any leadership role. Obviously, spiritually, for all of us, we decrease, Jesus increases. But if we think about it humanly in the organizations we lead, and we think about a leadership succession plan and strategy, there is the idea at some point that a current leader, an established leader, at some point has to decrease so other emerging leaders can rise up. What we find is the same way the most dangerous part of air travel is the landing and the takeoff. It's not the time in the air. With leadership, the most dangerous time is that transition time, when one leader's taking off and another leader's landing. When you think about Jesus and John the Baptist, when Jesus was now becoming the leader, humanly speaking, he was God, so he was always the leader, but in that transition of John the Baptist influence to Jesus, what happens in Matthew 4? We find Jesus having this spiritual warfare time out in the desert where he's directly confronted by the devil with temptation and lies, and he's in this time of prayer and fasting and seeking the Father. And I think what we find is there's real spiritual warfare that happens in times of leadership transition that we may not have noticed at other times. Then when we look at Jesus toward the end of his life, when he's ready to transition the leadership to his 12 disciples, what happens? Gethsemane happens. This agonizing time deep in his soul. We see betrayal. We see people denying him. We see people's own agendas rising up. And then ultimately we see the crucifixion, followed by the resurrection, of course, and this final recommissioning of those 12. But what we see is this upheaval of spiritual warfare. We see again in Acts chapter 20, when Paul is announcing to the Ephesian elders that he's going to be transitioning out and out of the leadership, and they're taking more prominent role. In chapter 20, verse 28, Paul says to the Ephesian elders, "Pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to care for the church of God which he obtained with his own blood." So he mentions the Holy Spirit, the presence of the Holy Spirit and the commissioning of the Holy Spirit among these elders. And then in verse 29 he says, "I know that after my departure, fierce wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock." So he says, here's the danger. Yes, the Holy Spirit has put you here, but from the outside, fierce wolves will come in and try to destroy the flock. So there's this external attack. And then he says this in verse 30, "And from among your own selves will arise men speaking twisted things to draw away the disciples after them." So he says not only these wolves coming from the outside, but from among you, there are even people who are self-centered. They're more about themselves than they are about Jesus. They're more about their own ministry than they are about the gospel. They will rise up. And both of these, the external wolves, the internal self-seekers, it happens during transition. In light of this, wolves coming in and self-centered leaders rising up, here's what Paul says, because it's not just a hopeless situation. He's speaking faith and hope here in verse 32. "And now I commend you to God and to the word of his grace, which is able to build you up and give you an inheritance among those who are sanctified." While acknowledging savage wolves that come from the outside and self-centered leaders who rise up from within during transition times, Paul ultimately puts his trust in God and the word of his grace. It doesn't mean he doesn't plan. God's grace doesn't negate the need for wisdom. It doesn't negate the need for being smart. So listen, whether you are seeing a runway that you need to land on at some point, you're an established leader and you know at some point you're going to land. Or if you're an emerging leader, you're leading in some great capacity somewhere, but you know there's another level of leadership and you're ready to take off and go change the world. We need a plan. We need a strategy, we need the wisdom of God, but ultimately we need God himself and we need the grace of God.